last session in our series on spiritual gifts. We've made it. On Sunday, we talked through each of the spiritual gifts and what they could look like when they're being used in the community of the church. And we won't go back over that again today and try and summarize further, because even Sunday's teaching was almost summarized too briefly on each of the gifts. We really could do a whole Sunday morning on each and every one of them. So what we do want to do with our last mooring session on this today is just talk about some of the themes that emerged in Sunday's teaching and do a little bit more thinking together on those. Now, before we dive in, you want to make sure to have our handout that lists each of the spiritual gifts and their short definition handy. That'll come in useful as we're discussing today. One of the themes that came up as we were talking about some of the gifts was that we don't want to be constrained by the practical. We talked about that on Sunday. And what we meant by that was that, yes, we need some of the more practical gifts like administration and leadership in the church. God gives these to church communities for a reason. But we don't want to be limited by practical things. God calls us to big things, right? God-sized things. I think that's a place that we very much want to be in, knowing that we're diving into a thing and it can only be successful if God is with us. And those are things that require gifts like the gift of faith. So that's going to be the first thing you get to discuss in your groups today. Just talk about an experience that you've had or that you've heard about where a lot of faith was required to make it happen, to do a big thing, a big God-sized thing. And how did a practical gift like administration or leadership help that thing to be successful? Or maybe there was a lack of balance in the endeavor, like too much practicality and not enough faith. Or maybe leading with too much faith and not backing that up with the practicality, like getting the nuts and bolts in place to make sure that it practically could be done. The second theme that emerged on Sunday was the idea that sometimes God will involve us in one-time or occasional things where we do what looks a bit like having a spiritual gift that's not normally one of our own. I told the story of someone who was involved in a one-time work of spiritual healing. God does these things, but having a spiritual gift in a certain area means doing these things on an ongoing basis. So that brings us to the next question that you can talk about with your group. Have you ever felt that God has done something through you, once or twice, occasionally, that is outside your usual area of gifting? Like he just involved you in something that seemed off the wall in the moment, but you could definitely stand back and say, yeah, God did something in that moment, and I was just so wowed to be a part of it. A third theme that ran like a small thread through our teaching on Sunday was this idea that God involves us somehow in the supernatural. While we were talking specifically there about the gift of miracles, I shared a quote from the author Timothy Keller, and it went like this: "Through our prayers, God gives us influence on the universe in some way." And what he was getting at in that quote was that God has created all things. Inside of what he's created, he allows our prayers to have an effect on how things turn out. And the important part of that statement is the last bit, in some way. We don't suppose to know how God works this. That's his territory, not ours. I said on Sunday, we'll leave the running of the universe to God. Thank you very much. So I'm going to get you to react to that quote in your groups. Do you think our prayers affect the universe in some way, God's creation, in terms of how things turn out? Do you know someone who seems to have a spiritual gift in this area, like miracles or healing or intercession? The last theme, and this turned up all over the place, was this idea that as we may interact with the supernatural, and some of those spiritual gifts definitely interact with the supernatural in some way, there's an important role for Scripture. For instance, if someone offers a word of knowledge, a special revelation from God, do we want to just take that at face value, or do we want to have something to test that against? I think we want to be able to test it, right? Something that I said repeatedly on Sunday was that nothing, not a word of knowledge, not a prophetic word, not a word of wisdom will be given that will ever contradict Scripture. So here's the last thing you can spend some time talking about. If someone with one of these gifts were to give you a word of some kind from God, how would you use Scripture and other people that you know who are spiritually mature? How would you use those two things together to discern if this word was true and if it's a wise thing to go and do? It's a tall order, isn't it? Because who has total command of the Scriptures? Well, Jesus, of course, accurately applied the truth of Scripture to push back on Satan when Satan was tempting him for 40 days and 40 nights in the desert. But none of us are Jesus, are we? So how would we go about using Scripture in concert with the people in our church community in this way? Well, and with that, after 4 weeks, we've reached the end of our series on spiritual gifts. I hope you've learned some new things. I know I certainly have. And I hope this gives you some fresh ideas, gives us fresh ideas on how our Blue Water community can work together most effectively and tackle whatever big God-sized things He has for us in the months and the years ahead.